I stared at the severance agreement resting on the polished oak table. 3 months of pay. That was the pathetic price they put on 20 years of my life and an algorithm worth $500 million. My name is Richard Vance. I am 48 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I had been the lead systems architect at a logistics firm that practically ran the supply chain of the entire West Coast. The man sitting across from me was Nicholas Thorne, the newly appointed chief executive officer. He was 32, wore a custom tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car, and had a smile that reminded me of a shark testing the waters before a bite. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together in a practiced gesture of faux sympathy. He told me that the company was going in a younger direction. He used words like agile, dynamic, and disruptive. He said my contributions were valued, but the board felt that my traditional approach was no longer aligned with their visionary future. It was a corporate way of saying I was too old, too expensive, and entirely disposable. What he did not say, but what we both knew, was that they were preparing for a massive acquisition. A massive tech conglomerate was circling us, ready to buy the company for hundreds of millions of dollars. The crown jewel of this acquisition was version 7, the predictive logistics algorithm I had built from scratch. Nicholas wanted me gone so he could claim the equity that rightfully belonged to me and distribute it among his cronies on the board. The audacity of it made my blood boil, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. I had learned a long time ago that showing emotion in a boardroom was like bleeding in front of a predator. I calmly asked him about the transition period. He explained that I would have 30 days to hand over my responsibilities, and then came the real insult. He wanted me to train my replacement. Her name was Olivia. She was a 24-year-old recent graduate from an Ivy League university, hired specifically because she was cheap, inexperienced, and would not ask difficult questions about equity or patents. They wanted me to download 20 years of institutional knowledge into her brain in 4 weeks, hand over the master keys to the kingdom, and quietly disappear into the sunset with a few meager paychecks. I picked up the pen and signed the acknowledgement of the transition period, though I explicitly left the severance agreement blank. Nicholas frowned, pushing the severance paper closer to me. He insisted that I needed to sign it to secure my payout. I told him I needed my lawyer to review it first, a standard protocol that even he could not dispute. He let out a condescending chuckle and told me not to take too long, implying that the offer might not stay on the table forever. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the glass-walled office without looking back. The walk back to my desk felt like moving underwater. The open-plan office was buzzing with the usual frantic energy of a Tuesday morning. Junior analysts were arguing over spreadsheets, phones were ringing, and the stale smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. None of them knew that the man who had built the very infrastructure they were using was just told to pack his bags. I sat down at my workstation and stared at the dual monitors. Lines of code scrolled down the screen, familiar and comforting. This was my domain. I knew every function, every variable, every hidden back door. My coworker Jason rolled his chair over to my cubicle. Jason was 45, a database administrator who had survived 3 different rounds of layoffs by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. He took one look at my face and knew exactly what had happened. He asked me if it was the end of the line. I nodded slowly. He swore under his breath, glancing nervously toward the executive suites. He told me that there had been rumors that Nicholas was cleaning house to make the books look as profitable as possible before the acquisition finalized. Jason warned me not to do anything stupid, reminding me that the company had a team of vicious corporate lawyers who would ruin my life if I tried to sabotage the servers or delete any data. I thanked Jason for his concern and assured him I was not going to do anything illegal. And I meant it. I had no intention of breaking the law. I had a daughter, Chloe Vance, who was in her first year of college. I could not risk going to prison or facing bankruptcy. But as I sat there, staring at the flashing cursor on my terminal, a cold, calculated anger began to take root in my chest. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought I was just an aging programmer who did not understand the ruthless mechanics of modern corporate warfare. But Nicholas had made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that because I wrote the code while employed by the company owned the code. It was a common assumption, reinforced by the aggressive intellectual property assignment clauses in our employment contracts. But I was not an idiot. I had spent countless evenings reading through legal statutes, protecting myself against exactly this kind of scenario. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small encrypted external drive. It contained the original source code for the core kernel of version 7. The kernel was the engine that made the entire algorithm work, the piece of pure mathematical genius that allowed it to predict supply chain disruptions with terrifying accuracy. What Nicholas did not know, and what I was about to use to burn his little empire to the ground, was the exact origin of that kernel. I had not written it at this desk. I had not written it on company time, and I certainly had not written it using company equipment. I had written it 5 years ago, during a 3-month unpaid medical sabbatical when I was recovering from a severe back injury. I wrote it on my own personal laptop, sitting on my living room couch, purely as a personal academic exercise. At the time, the company was exclusively focused on hardware distribution. They had absolutely no interest in software-based predictive logistics. It was not until 2 years later that they pivoted their entire business model and asked me to integrate my personal project into their new platform. I agreed to license it to them internally, but I never signed over the copyright. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that no one in the office noticed. I was going to train Olivia. I was going to be the best mentor she ever had. And then when my 30 days were up, I was going to walk out the door and take my algorithm with me. Nicholas Thorne wanted to play a strategic game of chess, but he did not realize that I owned the board. The next morning, Olivia arrived at my desk promptly at 8 o'clock. She was carrying a sleek new laptop and a notebook filled with color-coded tabs. She introduced herself with a bright, enthusiastic smile, clearly eager to impress the senior architect she had been assigned to shadow. She had absolutely no idea that her arrival signaled my execution. I greeted her politely, offering her the spare chair next to my workstation. I decided right then and there that I would not hold her responsible for the sins of the executive board. She was just a pawn in Nicholas Thorne's grand strategy, a cheap resource brought in to absorb my knowledge before they discarded me. I resolved to be the best instructor she could possibly hope for, precisely because it served my own long-term interests. We started with the basics. I walked her through the overarching architecture of the logistics network, explaining how the different modules communicated with the central database. She was undeniably smart, asking sharp, insightful questions that showed she had thoroughly read the documentation. However, reading documentation and understanding the living, breathing beast that was the system were two entirely different things. For the first week, I taught her the daily maintenance routines, the bug tracking procedures, and the minor optimizations that kept the servers from catching fire during peak traffic hours. She absorbed the information like a sponge, furiously scribbling notes and nodding along. But as the days turned into a second week, the training had to move deeper into the core systems. This was the danger zone. The closer we got to the predictive algorithm itself, the more careful I had to be. I showed her the input streams, the historical data processors, and the output interfaces. I taught her how to interpret the results and how to adjust the weighting parameters for different seasonal fluctuations. But I never, not even once, showed her the underlying source code of the master kernel. Whenever we approached the directories that housed the encrypted logic, I would casually steer the conversation toward a different topic or assign her a time-consuming debugging task to keep her occupied. Olivia was perceptive. By the middle of the second week, she started asking questions about the encryption layers. She noticed that a significant portion of the processing power was being routed through a restricted black box module. I gave her a rehearsed answer about legacy security protocols and third-party dependencies. She accepted the explanation, but I could see the gears turning in her head. She was beginning to realize that the system she was hired to manage was entirely dependent on a piece of architecture she was not allowed to see. Meanwhile, my evenings were spent entirely in the company of my lawyer and oldest friend, Edward Pierce. Edward was a brilliant corporate litigator who specialized in intellectual property disputes. We would meet at his office downtown, ordering takeout and poring over my employment contracts, non-disclosure agreements, and the original copyright filings. Edward was a meticulous man, the kind of lawyer who enjoyed finding loopholes more than he enjoyed winning arguments. When I first explained my situation to him, he had been skeptical. He warned me that fighting a corporation the size of my employer was usually a fast track to financial ruin. But then I showed him the timeline of the kernel's development and the specific provisions of California Labor Code Section 2870. Section 2870 is a beautiful piece of legislation. It explicitly states that an employment agreement cannot require an employee to assign their rights to an invention if they developed it entirely on their own time without using the employer's equipment, supplies, facilities, or trade secret information. Furthermore, the invention must not relate to the employer's business or actual or demonstrably anticipated research or development at the time of conception. Edward spent 3 days verifying my claims. He reviewed my old medical records, proving I was on an unpaid leave of absence when the code was written. He examined the metadata of the original source files, confirming they were created on my personal machine. He even pulled the company's annual reports from 5 years ago, conclusively demonstrating that their business model at the time had absolutely nothing to do with predictive software. When Edward finally looked up from his mountains of paperwork, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. He told me that our case was not just strong. It was practically bulletproof. The company had no legal claim to the core kernel. I owned it entirely. The fact that they had been using it for the last 2 years without a formal licensing agreement was not a waiver of my rights. It was a massive liability on their part. If we pulled the plug, the company would not only lose their primary operational tool, but they would also be exposed to devastating copyright infringement damages. Back at the office, the atmosphere was growing increasingly tense. Nicholas Thorne was strutting around the executive floor like a peacock, holding endless meetings with investment bankers and venture capitalists. The acquisition rumors had escalated into concrete negotiations. The potential buyer, a global supply chain conglomerate, was conducting their final due diligence. They were particularly interested in version 7, viewing it as the primary justification for their astronomical valuation. Nicholas was desperate to finalize the deal before the end of the quarter, which meant he needed my transition period to be completed flawlessly. He started dropping by my desk unexpectedly, offering fake smiles and asking passive-aggressive questions about Olivia's progress. He wanted to ensure that she was fully prepared to take over the reins. I played the part of the compliant, defeated veteran perfectly. I assured him that she was learning quickly and that the handover was proceeding right on schedule. He patted me on the shoulder, a condescending gesture that made my skin crawl, and told me that he appreciated my professionalism. He even had the nerve to suggest that he might throw in an extra month of severance pay if everything went smoothly. I thanked him through gritted teeth, knowing full well that in a few weeks he would be begging me for mercy. My strategy was simple but required absolute precision. I was not going to sabotage the company. Sabotage is illegal. Sabotage leads to criminal charges. Instead, I was simply going to enforce my legal rights. The kernel I had written included a standard industry practice license verification routine. When I had originally integrated it into the company's servers, I had configured the routine to automatically bypass the check, essentially providing them with an indefinite evaluation period. All I had to do was update the configuration file to require a valid license key upon the next scheduled system reboot. It was a perfectly legal action, a routine maintenance update to a piece of third-party software. The only problem for Nicholas was that I was the third party, and I had absolutely no intention of granting them a license. As the end of my 30 days approached, I began the quiet process of securing my position. I filed the formal copyright registration under a newly formed limited liability company. I moved all my personal files off the corporate servers, and I continued to smile, helping Olivia navigate the labyrinthine complexities of a system that was about to become completely useless. The trap was set, The bait was taken, and all I had to do was wait for the jaws to snap shut. The turning point arrived during my third week of training. Olivia and I were sitting in the break room drinking terrible office coffee and discussing the intricacies of server load balancing. She had grown more comfortable around me, shedding the nervous energy of a new hire and revealing a sharp, analytical mind that I genuinely respected. She was telling me about a confusing email she had received from the Human Resources Department regarding her access privileges. She opened her laptop to show me the message. As she scrolled through her inbox, my eyes caught a glimpse of a subject line that made my blood run cold. It was an email forwarded from Nicholas Thorne to the head of Human Resources. With Olivia copied by mistake, I asked her to open it. She hesitated for a moment, sensing my sudden shift in demeanor, but then clicked on the message. The email was short, brutal, and utterly damning. Nicholas was instructing Human Resources to expedite my termination paperwork, specifically to ensure I was off the payroll before the acquisition date. He explicitly stated that terminating me prior to the finalization of the deal was necessary to invalidate my equity vesting schedule, which would free up a massive block of shares to be distributed among the executive team as performance bonuses. Olivia read the words on the screen, her face draining of color. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. She had finally realized the true nature of her employment. She was not just my replacement. She was the instrument of my financial execution. The silence in the break room was heavy and uncomfortable. I did not yell. I did not direct my anger toward the young woman. I simply looked at the screen and let the reality of the situation settle over both of us. Olivia closed her laptop, her hands shaking slightly. She apologized to me, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me she had no idea they were doing this to me, that she thought I was retiring or moving on to a better opportunity. I told her not to worry about it, that corporate environments were inherently ruthless and she was just caught in the crossfire. But that email changed everything. It was no longer just a suspicion. I now had documented proof of their malicious intent to defraud me of my earned compensation. I asked Olivia to forward the email to my personal account. She did not hesitate. Within seconds, the message was safely stored in my encrypted inbox, ready to be handed over to Edward Pierce. From that moment on, the dynamic between Olivia and me shifted. She was no longer just a naive intern absorbing information. She had become an unwitting ally in my quiet rebellion. She started paying closer attention to the executive communications, subtly forwarding me meeting minutes and internal memos that detailed the progress of the acquisition. It became clear that the buyers were infatuated with version 7. They considered it the singular asset that justified their enormous purchase offer. With my final week approaching, I decided it was time to implement the fail-safe. I logged into the primary server cluster late one evening, when the office was practically deserted. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed dimmer, casting long, strange shadows across the rows of empty cubicles. I accessed the configuration settings for the core kernel. The process was surprisingly mundane for something that was about to cause so much chaos. I simply changed a single Boolean variable from false to true. That tiny adjustment instructed the algorithm to verify its licensing status against an external authorization server that I controlled. I set the verification protocol to trigger exactly 72 hours after my scheduled departure. This would give Nicholas Thorne enough time to celebrate his supposed victory, enough time to finalize the initial stages of the acquisition, and enough time to feel completely secure in his position. It was a calculated delay, designed to maximize the psychological impact of the impending disaster. I also drafted a comprehensive technical document detailing the exact nature of the third-party dependency, explicitly stating that the core kernel was proprietary software owned by an external entity and required a valid commercial license for continued operation. I embedded this document deep within the system documentation, ensuring that when the crash inevitably happened, their own internal investigations would point directly to their legal negligence. The next few days were a masterclass in acting. I continued to train Olivia, showing her how to monitor the system dashboards and respond to automated alerts. She was nervous, knowing that something significant was happening behind the scenes, but she remained professional and focused. I appreciated her discretion. She asked me once, during a quiet moment in the server room, what was going to happen after I left. I looked at the blinking lights of the server racks, listening to the steady hum of the cooling fans, and told her that the system would eventually require maintenance that only the original creator could provide. She nodded slowly, understanding the implication without needing further explanation. On my final day, the atmosphere in the office was strangely festive. It was a Friday, and the Human Resources Department had organized a small, patronizing farewell gathering in the main conference room. There was a cheap sheet cake with my name spelled incorrectly, a few obligatory balloons, and a stack of paper plates. Nicholas Thorne stood at the head of the table, offering a toast to my long and dedicated service. He spoke eloquently about my contributions, weaving a narrative of a respected elder statesman passing the torch to the next generation. I stood there, holding a plastic fork and a slice of dry cake, listening to the man who was actively trying to steal my life's work praise my dedication. Jason stood near the back of the room, looking deeply uncomfortable. Olivia stood beside him, her eyes darting between me and Nicholas. When the speeches were over, I shook hands with the junior developers, offered some parting words of encouragement, and returned to my desk to collect my final belongings. I packed a small cardboard box with a few personal items, a framed photograph of my daughter Chloe, a favorite coffee mug, and a mechanical keyboard I had used for the last decade. I left the corporate laptop on the desk, perfectly clean and wiped of all personal data. Nicholas escorted me to the elevator, a broad, triumphant smile plastered across his face. He extended his hand as the elevator doors opened. He told me it had been a pleasure working with me and wished me luck in my future endeavors. I shook his hand firmly, looking him dead in the eye. I thanked him for the opportunity and told him I was looking forward to a very profitable future. As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off his smug expression, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The countdown had begun. 72 hours until the boardroom would burn. The weekend passed with agonizing slowness. I spent Saturday morning at the park with Chloe, trying to focus on her stories about college professors and dorm room drama, but my mind kept drifting back to the server logs. By Monday morning, I was sitting in Edward Pierce's office, sipping black coffee and waiting for the inevitable phone call. We had prepared a comprehensive legal dossier, complete with time-stamped code repositories, medical records, and a drafted cease and desist order. Edward was wearing a sharp navy suit, looking remarkably calm for a man who was about to engage in corporate warfare with a multi-million-dollar logistics firm. I, on the other hand, was vibrating with nervous energy, pacing back and forth across his expensive Persian rug. At exactly 10 o'clock, the licensing protocol on the core kernel triggered. I knew this because a small script I had running on my personal server pinged me the moment the company's system attempted to verify its authorization token and failed. The rejection initiated a cascading shutdown sequence across their entire predictive logistics network. The system did not crash violently, it simply paused, freezing all incoming data streams and outgoing shipping manifests. A polite, automated message appeared on every terminal in the logistics department, stating that the proprietary software required a valid commercial license to resume operations, and providing a contact email address that belonged directly to my newly formed limited liability company. The silence in Edward's office was broken by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. I looked at the caller identification. It was Nicholas Thorne. I let it ring 4 times before answering, putting the call on speaker so Edward could hear every word. Nicholas was furious, his voice tight and constrained, like a coiled spring about to snap. He demanded to know what I had done to the servers. He accused me of hacking, of industrial sabotage, and of extortion. He threatened to have the authorities waiting at my front door before lunch. I listened to his tirade, letting him exhaust himself, taking a strange satisfaction in the raw panic underlying his aggressive posturing. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, I spoke softly and calmly. I explained that I had not hacked anything. I told him that I had simply enforced a standard licensing check on a piece of proprietary software that belonged entirely to me. Nicholas scoffed, asserting that the company owned every line of code I had written during my employment. That was when Edward leaned toward the speakerphone, introducing himself as my legal counsel. Edward's voice was smooth and professional, the tone of a predator who had just cornered its prey. He calmly cited California Labor Code Section 2870, methodically breaking down the legal reality of the situation. Edward explained that the core kernel was developed on my own time, on my own equipment, and entirely separate from the company's business focus at the time of creation. Therefore, the copyright belonged to me. The company had been using an unlicensed evaluation copy, which had now expired. Nicholas went dead silent. The line was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning in his office. When he finally spoke again, his voice lacked its usual arrogant edge. It was replaced by a desperate, strained desperation. The acquisition deal was in its final stages, and the buyers were scheduled to run a live demonstration of the logistics platform that very afternoon. Without the predictive kernel, the entire system was nothing more than a glorified spreadsheet. Nicholas tried to pivot, offering to reinstate my employment immediately, complete with a generous salary increase and a substantial signing bonus. He promised to rip up the severance agreement and formally recognize my contributions. It was a pathetic display of corporate backpedaling, a desperate attempt to plug a leak in a sinking ship. I told him that I had absolutely no interest in returning to work for a company that had actively plotted to defraud me of my equity. I reminded him of the email Olivia had accidentally seen, the one detailing his plan to terminate me specifically to steal my shares. That revelation hit him like a physical blow. The silence returned, heavier and more profound than before. Edward took over the conversation, outlining our terms. We were not demanding my old job back. We were demanding a formal licensing agreement for the continued use of the software. The price for this license would be a lump sum payment, equal to 5% of the total acquisition value, payable immediately upon signing. Furthermore, we demanded a public acknowledgement of my ownership of the intellectual property. Nicholas sputtered, claiming the board of directors would never approve such an outrageous demand. Edward countered by simply stating that if the board did not approve it, the acquisition would fail, the company's valuation would plummet, and the shareholders would undoubtedly launch a massive class action lawsuit for gross negligence. We gave him exactly 2 hours to present our terms to the board. I hung up the phone, feeling a massive weight lift off my shoulders. The trap had closed perfectly. We had caught them completely off guard, leveraging their own greed and lack of technical oversight against them. Now, all that was left was to wait and see if the board of directors possessed enough common sense to realize they had been outmaneuvered. I poured myself another cup of coffee, looking out the window at the bustling city below, knowing that somewhere in a glass-walled conference room, a group of powerful executives were sweating profusely over a problem they could not simply dismiss with a severance check. An hour and 45 minutes later, Edward's office phone rang. This time, it was not Nicholas Thorne on the line. It was the chairman of the board of directors, a man who possessed a reputation for being ruthless but pragmatically intelligent. He did not yell. He did not issue empty threats. He spoke with the cold, calculated precision of a man who had just reviewed a disastrous legal assessment and understood exactly how much trouble his company was in. He confirmed that their corporate legal team had reviewed the copyright documentation and the labor code statutes we had provided. They had concluded that litigating the matter would not only freeze the acquisition indefinitely, but would likely result in a public trial that would destroy the company's valuation entirely. The chairman asked if our demands were flexible. Edward informed him that they were absolute. The silence on the other end of the line lasted for several long seconds before the chairman finally sighed in defeat. He agreed to the licensing fee and the public acknowledgement, but he added one more condition. The board wanted my personal assurance that the transition of the software to the new acquiring company would be seamless and fully supported. I leaned into the speakerphone and agreed, stating that as a licensed vendor, I would provide comprehensive support services at an aggressive hourly consulting rate. The chairman chuckled dryly, acknowledging the audacity of the counteroffer, and accepted. The paperwork was drafted, reviewed, and signed electronically within the hour. As soon as the wire transfer confirmation hit my secure account, I logged back into the server and issued the authorization token. The system hummed back to life, the data streams flowing smoothly just in time for their afternoon demonstration. The acquisition proceeded without a hitch, finalizing 2 weeks later for a staggering sum. My 5% licensing fee translated to a payout that eclipsed what my equity shares would have ever been worth. The aftermath at the company was swift and brutal. Nicholas Thorne was unceremoniously fired by the board for gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and for exposing the company to catastrophic legal risk. He walked out of the building carrying a small cardboard box, stripped of his golden parachute and his professional reputation. Jason sent me a text message describing the scene, noting the poetic justice of watching the arrogant executive being escorted out by security. Olivia, having demonstrated grace under pressure and possessing a solid foundational understanding of the newly licensed software, was promoted to a senior analyst role. I never set foot in that corporate office again. I moved to a quiet coastal town, investing the settlement money carefully and paying for Chloe's college tuition in full. I still write code, but only on projects that interest me and strictly under my own terms. The entire experience taught me a valuable lesson about the nature of corporate loyalty. A company is a machine designed to extract value and generate profit. It does not have feelings, it does not possess loyalty, and it will discard you the moment you become inconvenient or expensive. The only defense is to know your worth, to understand the legal framework that governs your industry, and to never, ever surrender the keys to your own intellectual property. Nicholas Thorne thought he was playing a game of strategic chess. He just never realized that I had designed the board, wrote the rules, and possessed the only winning move.